In the 1930s, workers clearing jungle in southern Costa Rica for a banana plantation began turning up large stone balls. Not roughly spherical rocks shaped by water or erosion, perfectly spherical carved objects, some the size of a basketball, others nearly 2 meters across and weighing 16 tons, all made from a hard volcanic rock called granodiorite. They were scattered across the lowland forest floor, some alone, some in clusters, some arranged in lines or geometric patterns. No one knew what they were. No local tradition preserved a clear memory of who had made them or why. The indigenous culture that produced them, the Diquís people of the Cherokee Highlands, had been effectively destroyed by Spanish colonization, and with it most of the oral knowledge that might have explained these objects. Hundreds of them have now been documented. They have been dated to between roughly 600 and 1500 AD. They are listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and the question of precisely why they were made, how they were shaped to such accuracy using only stone tools, and what they meant to the people who invested enormous labor in creating them remains, in the detailed sense, unanswered. Based on archaeological excavation records and historical documentation, this is the story of the Diquís stone spheres. The United Fruit Company was one of the most powerful corporations in Central America during the first half of the 20th century, controlling vast tracts of land in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and other countries for banana cultivation. When workers clearing jungle in the Diquís Delta region of southern Costa Rica began their operations in the 1930s, archaeology was not on their agenda. What they found when they pushed the forest back changed that, at least temporarily. Stone balls of varying sizes began emerging from the undergrowth as the trees came down. The workers' initial response was practical. Some of the smaller spheres were removed and used as ornamental features at company facilities. Some of the larger ones were dynamited by workers who believed, incorrectly, that gold might be hidden inside. The destruction of an unknown number of spheres before their archaeological significance was recognized represents a loss that cannot be quantified, since there is no record of how many were destroyed before the scientific community became involved. The person most responsible for establishing the spheres as objects of serious archaeological study was Doris Stone, daughter of a United Fruit Company executive, who encountered them in the late 1930s and recognized their importance. Stone, who later became a prominent archaeologist specializing in Central American prehistory, published the first systematic descriptions of the spheres in 1943, drawing attention to their number, their distribution across the Diquís Delta, and the puzzling precision of their spherical shape. Her work brought the objects to the attention of the broader archaeological community and established the basic documentation framework that subsequent researchers built on. The material from which the Diquís spheres were made is granodiorite, an igneous rock similar in composition to granite, extremely hard, with a fine crystalline structure that holds a smooth surface well but resists shaping. The source of the granodiorite, used for most of the spheres, has been traced to the Talamanca Mountains north and east of the Diquís Delta, at distances ranging from a few to several tens of kilometers from where the finished spheres were found. Shaping a rough block of granodiorite into a perfect sphere using only stone tools requires a specific sequence of operations. The initial rough shaping can be done by percussion, striking the surface with a harder stone to knock off large flakes and progressively approach a spherical form. As the shape becomes more refined, the technique shifts toward abrasion, grinding the surface against other stone to remove high points and smooth the surface. The final polish is achieved with progressively finer abrasive material, similar in principle to modern sandpaper, but using natural stone and sand. What is technically demanding about this process is not any individual step, but the maintenance of spherical geometry throughout. A sphere has no flat reference surface. Checking the sphericity of a partially finished object requires measuring from a central point in multiple directions simultaneously, which, with ancient tools, means using templates or gauges of some kind, or a high level of tactile and visual assessment developed through long practice. Modern measurements of Diquís spheres have found that the largest ones are spherical to within a centimetre or two of theoretical perfection across their 2-metre diameter, a level of accuracy of roughly 1%. That is not an accident. It reflects a systematic approach to quality control that was developed and transmitted within the craft tradition. The total number of Diquís stone spheres that have been documented is approximately 300, though the true original number is unknown, given the disruption and destruction that occurred before systematic survey began. They range in diameter from a few centimetres, small enough to hold in one hand, to approximately 2.57 metres, with a corresponding range in weight from a few kilograms to around 16 metric tons. The size distribution is not random. Spheres cluster in certain size ranges, suggesting that specific sizes had specific purposes or significance. The geographical distribution concentrates in the Diquís Delta region of the Osa Peninsula in southwestern Costa Rica, which gives the tradition its name. Within this region, spheres have been found at locations corresponding to pre-Columbian settlement sites, the areas where the Diquís people built their villages and ceremonial spaces. The association between spheres and settlement sites is documented in the excavation records of the Costa Rican National Museum, which has conducted systematic archaeological work in the region. Several spheres have been found at the Finca 6 archaeological site, one of the best preserved pre-Columbian sites in the region and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2014. At Finca 6, spheres were found in what appears to be their original positions, placed in geometric arrangements in front of large residential or ceremonial structures. The spatial relationship between the spheres and the structures is one of the few cases where the original context of the objects can be assessed with some confidence, because the site was not subject to the same degree of disturbance as lower-lying areas that came under intensive agricultural use. The spheres found at Finca 6 include a line of 4 large spheres arranged in front of what appears to have been a major building, and additional spheres placed at other significant points around the site. This arrangement, spheres marking the approach to an important structure, is consistent with a function related to status display, ceremonial space definition, or both. The Diquís sphere tradition is associated with the pre-Columbian cultures of the Diquís region, which occupied southwestern Costa Rica from approximately 300 AD through the period of Spanish contact in the early 16th century. The sphere-making tradition appears to have been most active between roughly 600 and 1500 AD, based on radiocarbon dates of organic material found in association with spheres at excavated sites. The Diquís people were not a single unified political entity in the modern sense. Archaeological evidence indicates a society organized around chiefdoms, regional leaders with authority over defined territories, supported by a social hierarchy that included specialists in craft production and long-distance exchange. The presence of gold objects at sites associated with spheres is significant. Goldworking was a high-status craft in this region, and the association of gold artifacts with sphere sites supports the interpretation that the spheres were connected to the activities of the social elite. Spanish colonial records from the early period of contact provide limited but useful information about the societies of southwestern Costa Rica. These records describe a population organized around permanent villages with substantial structures, practicing intensive agriculture supplemented by hunting and fishing, and maintaining long-distance exchange relationships with other regions of Central America. By the time systematic ethnographic documentation was possible, the sphere-making tradition had ended, and living memory of its meaning had been lost, fragmenting through the disruptions of colonization, epidemic disease, and forced relocation. What the archaeological record cannot recover, and what the loss of living memory made irretrievable, is the specific, symbolic meaning of the spheres within the belief system of the people who made them. Physical analysis can establish what they are and approximately when they were made. It cannot recover the conversations about why they were made, what they represented, or what obligations their presence imposed on those who lived near them. The function of the Diquís stone spheres has been discussed extensively in the archaeological literature, and a range of interpretations has been proposed. None has achieved complete consensus because the evidence available from excavation and historical records is not sufficient to confirm any single explanation against the alternatives. The status symbol interpretation is the most widely accepted among professional archaeologists. In this view, the spheres function similarly to other large-scale prestige objects in pre-Columbian societies. Their value derived from the labor and resources required to produce them. Their display communicated the wealth and authority of the chief or community that commissioned them, and their placement in front of elite residences made a public statement about the social hierarchy of the settlement. The archaeological association of spheres with high-status sites and with gold objects is consistent with this interpretation. The territorial marker interpretation proposes that spheres were placed at boundaries between chiefdom territories, serving as permanent, visible, and difficult to relocate demarcations of political space. The distribution of spheres across the Diquís region, with clusters in some areas and absences in others, is broadly consistent with a territorial function, though the disruption of original positions makes this difficult to test rigorously. The astronomical interpretation has attracted popular attention and some scholarly discussion. Several researchers have noted that certain arrangements of spheres, where original positions can be assessed, appear to be aligned with solar or astronomical phenomena, the direction of sunrise or sunset at solstices, for example. If accurate, these alignments would suggest that at least some spheres functioned as calendrical markers or astronomical references. The evidence for this interpretation is less well established than for the status symbol interpretation, and researchers are cautious about claims based on alignments that may reflect selective attention to consistent cases rather than a general pattern. The logistics of transporting finished spheres, or large stone blocks intended for sphere making, from the granodiorite sources in the Talamanca Mountains to the lowland Diquís Delta settlements, represents one of the more practically demanding aspects of the sphere tradition. The terrain between source and destination includes river crossings, areas of dense forest, and elevation changes that would challenge any transport operation without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, neither of which were available in pre-Columbian Costa Rica. The most plausible transport mechanism, based on what is documented for similar operations in other parts of the pre-Columbian world, involves a combination of wooden rollers, ropes woven from plant fiber, and coordinated human labor organized at the community or chiefdom level. Ethnographic records from comparable societies in other regions of the world document the successful movement of very large stone objects using these methods, and experimental archaeology has confirmed the feasibility of the approach for objects in the size range of the Diquís spheres. The practical limitation is workforce size. Moving a sphere weighing several tons over rough terrain requires enough people to provide continuous pulling force, while others reposition the rollers ahead of the moving object. For the largest spheres, estimates suggest that coordinated teams of dozens to hundreds of workers would have been needed, organized and provisioned for an operation lasting days or weeks, depending on the distance. This scale of organized labor implies a chiefdom-level social organization capable of mobilizing and directing community resources toward a project that served the interests of the elite rather than immediate subsistence needs. The investment in transport was itself a statement about social power. A chief who could organize the movement of a 2-ton sphere from a mountain source to a village in the lowlands was demonstrating exactly the kind of organizational case authority that the sphere, once placed, would continue to symbolize. The object and the process of creating it reinforced the same social message. Modern analytical techniques have contributed substantially to understanding the Diquís spheres, particularly in establishing their chronology and the sourcing of their stone. The chronological picture that has emerged from radiocarbon dating of organic material from sphere-associated contexts confirms the production period between approximately 600 and 1500 AD, with the tradition apparently ending at or before Spanish contact, rather than as a direct result of it. Geochemical analysis of the granodiorite used in the spheres has been conducted by researchers including John Hoops of the University of Kansas, whose work on Costa Rican pre-Columbian cultures has produced detailed documentation of the sphere tradition. Elemental analysis of the stone has confirmed the Talamanca mountain source for most spheres and has allowed researchers to begin matching specific spheres to specific quarry outcrops, providing information about the geography of raw material procurement that helps reconstruct the logistics of the tradition. Precise measurement of sphere geometry using modern surveying equipment has quantified the sphericity that observers have noted since the objects were first described. The largest spheres achieve sphericity within a few centimeters of theoretical perfection across diameters of more than 2 meters. This accuracy is consistent with a systematic crafting process involving repeated measurement and correction, rather than an intuitive approach relying solely on visual judgment. Researchers have proposed that the craftspeople used stone or ceramic gauges, templates cut to specific curvature, to check the surface geometry at multiple points during the finishing process, a technique that would explain the consistent accuracy without requiring any technology beyond the objects themselves. X-ray fluorescence and other non-destructive surface analysis methods have been applied to sphere surfaces to characterize the polishing technique and to look for traces of pigment or other surface treatments that might have altered the appearance of the spheres when new. Some results suggest that certain spheres may have had painted or coated surfaces, which would have significantly changed their visual impact in the settlement context. The Diquís culture that produced the stone spheres did not have a writing system. Knowledge was transmitted orally through the teaching relationships between generations, through ritual and ceremonial contexts that embedded practical and symbolic information in memorable forms, and through the observation of practice across the life cycle of a community. This mode of transmission is effective and capable of maintaining complex knowledge across many generations. But it is vulnerable to disruption in ways that written traditions are not. The Spanish colonization of Central America, which reached southwestern Costa Rica in the 16th century, produced precisely the kind of disruption that destroyed oral knowledge traditions. The combination of epidemic disease, to which indigenous populations had no immunity, forced population movements, destruction of existing social structures, suppression of indigenous religious practices, and the deaths of the specialists who held technical and symbolic knowledge produced losses that could not be recovered. Within a few generations of contact, the specific meanings and practices associated with the sphere tradition were gone. What survives is the physical record and the limited documentation in Spanish colonial sources. The colonial accounts of southwestern Costa Rica describe chiefdom societies with elaborately ranked social hierarchies, large-scale feasting events, long-distance trade in prestige goods, and religious practices centered on specialist ritual practitioners. These descriptions are consistent with what the archaeological record shows, but do not specifically address the spheres, which, by the time Spanish observers were present, may already have been objects of a completed rather than living tradition. The loss is not simply one of historical knowledge about a specific culture. It is a more fundamental loss, the inability to understand the meaning world in which these objects functioned. What the spheres communicated to the people who walked past them every day, what obligations they created, what stories they evoked. All of this existed in the minds of people who are gone, encoded in a language and a symbolic system that no longer has living speakers. The Diquís stone spheres received UNESCO World Heritage designation in 2014, when 4 archaeological sites in the Diquís region, Finca 6, Batambal, El Silencio, and Grijalba II, were inscribed on the World Heritage List as the pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diquís. The inscription recognized both the outstanding universal value of the sphere tradition as a unique pre-Columbian cultural expression and the urgent need for protection and systematic study of the remaining in situ examples. The conservation challenges facing the Diquís spheres are multiple and intersecting. The most immediate is illicit removal. Spheres have been taken from archaeological sites and sold to collectors, used as garden ornaments at private residences and hotels across Costa Rica and internationally, and in some cases exported illegally. The Costa Rican National Museum has worked with international cultural property organizations to recover spheres that left the country, with some success. But many removed spheres cannot be repatriated because their provenance cannot be established with sufficient certainty, and others are simply not recoverable. The spheres that remain at or near their original sites face environmental challenges, including the growth of tree roots around and under them, which can cause displacement and cracking, and chemical weathering from the humid tropical climate. Conservation treatment of affected spheres has been carried out at Finca 6 and other managed sites, using methods that remove biological growth and stabilize the stone surface without altering its character. Community education programs in the Diquís region have engaged local residents, including descendants of indigenous groups who maintain cultural connections to the region, in the documentation, protection, and interpretation of the sphere sites. These programs work from the recognition that sustainable protection of archaeological sites requires the active involvement of local communities who live with the heritage in question, rather than purely external management imposed by national or international institutions. The Diquís stone spheres are, in one sense, an entirely human story. Objects made by people using tools that were available in their time, for purposes that fit within the social and symbolic frameworks documented in comparable pre-Columbian cultures across the Americas. There is nothing about them that requires extraordinary explanation. The craftsmanship is impressive, but it is the kind of impressiveness produced by skill, patience, and the accumulation of knowledge across generations, not by technology or knowledge unavailable to the people of the time and place. In another sense, the spheres are a reminder of how much of human cultural achievement has been lost, and of how thin the documentary record is for most of human history. The people who made these objects lived complex social lives, maintained elaborate ritual traditions, organized large-scale collective labor projects, and encoded their values and beliefs in material form, with enough skill to produce objects that remain striking 13 centuries later. Almost nothing of what they thought, believed, and communicated to each other survives beyond the objects themselves.